So I keep saying the parable we read, but we actually read 2 parables this morning, right? But the one I want to focus on most is the parable of the mustard seed. And it's a fairly short parable. It's actually just one single verse, verse 5. But it conveys the idea of being able to do great things if we would possess even the tiniest little bit of faith. Now, for those who are listening to Jesus teach on that day, the mustard seed would have been a common enough plant in that part of the world that those who were listening were able to immediately picture it without any reference. And I have read that a mustard seed, which we know is only tiny, it's about 1 millimeter big, that it can grow into a bush that is 9 meters tall. Now, for you old folks, that's about 30 feet, I think. And so Jesus is making the comparison that our faith, even if it starts really small, that we can do just incredible, amazing things. And these parables that we read this morning, they're actually Jesus' answer to the disciples' question about increasing their faith. Just preceding our reading this morning, there had been this lengthy discussion that Jesus was having with his disciples, this lengthy discussion about attitudes and responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities that he was talking about was forgiveness. And Jesus had just said that sometimes we even needed to forgive folks 70 times 7. So as Jesus is having this lengthy discussion with the disciples, they're thinking like, oh, wow. We need to have this kind of attitude. We have all these responsibilities. We even need to be very forgiving. How in the world are we going to manage to do all that? Jesus, you're going to have to increase our faith. Which is when Jesus says the whole thing about that even if you had the tiniest bit of faith, as much as a mustard seed, you could say to the mulberry tree, move and go into the sea. Now, if we had read this same in the Gospel of Matthew, it would have been about moving a mountain. But you get the idea. Jesus is saying that it's less about simply being given more faith, which is what they were asking, and it was more about actively using the faith that they already possessed. Because Jesus had been teaching the disciples for a while now. And Jesus was saying to them, you already know what you need to do. You already know what you need to do to make this ministry a success. You know what you need to do in order to take care of the people I love. So since you already know that, just go out and live that faith that you have confessed to believe. Now, faith is it's a complex word, and it's an even more complex concept, but one that we as Christians, we define and we redefine throughout our life journey. I have this understanding of faith that I had when I was a Sunday school kid, that was much deeper when I was a young woman, that is much deeper now as I'm a pretty old woman. It gets redefined how I understand it throughout my life journey. What does it mean for me to have faith? Because on some level, instinctively, we understand that increased faith brings us closer to God who has created us. That our increased faith somehow makes me more in tune with how I experience God's grace in my life. As our faith grows, our lives somehow become richer and more beautiful. At some point, we get to understand that faith can be very relational. And that mustard seed in Jesus' example comes to symbolize this potential that our faith has, this potential that our faith has to grow in that relationship with God, our Creator. Because a seed does not remain a seed. It eventually germinates. The seedling it breaks out of its shell and it grows into a full-size plant. And mustard trees, they're huge, despite the size of their seed to begin with. So it's not just about the size of our faith, but the truth that our faith can grow and that it can flourish. Now, as I mentioned, there was 2 parables in today's reading. The parable of the mustard seed and the growing faith is paired with the parable of the servant. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we learn from this particular parable that we don't simply live our faith or not based on what it is we want to do. Instead, we are taught by Jesus that it is our duty or our responsibility as Christians to live our faith. And this teaching reinforces it in the parable of the servant. Because remember, Jesus came to seek and to serve. And we even have the story that happens not just a little bit beyond where we're reading in today, where we will see Jesus get on his knees and wash the disciples' feet. Jesus, the incarnation of God, declares his followers as he does that to not just be servants anymore, but they will be his friends. And in this serving Jesus, it is this serving Jesus who tells the parable. And that's an important part to remember. Because Jesus, he's asking the disciples, now, does the master make dinner for the servants? And anyone who would have been listening would have said, well, of course not. That's not how their society worked. Then Jesus goes on to remind them that God, the master creator, does not owe anybody anything. Instead, it is our job as Christians to do our duty without expecting anything in return. Which is kind of a weird and radical concept in our today very self-absorbed kind of culture. We don't like to hear that God doesn't owe us anything. We like to demand of God that we have health and we have wealth and we have happiness because that's our due, because we go to church, we give of our tithes, we're good people, we deserve these good things in our life. But what Jesus is saying here is he's saying that if that is our mindset, then we are going to fail to grasp the sheer enormity of the grace that God has bestowed on us. And we, friends, are so very blessed here. And we are blessed because of God's grace towards us and not because we are owed God's favor. When we, as Christians, as individuals, and when we are as a church and a ministry are able to make that shift in our thinking, that is when our faith increases. And that is when we are able to do amazing things in God's name. When we make that shift that we have a responsibility that God has given us because of the grace that God has given to us, then we're able to feed the hungry. Then we're able to clothe the naked. Then we are able to care for the sick and the lonely. When we dedicate ourselves to God's service, we see our capacity for ministry grow. We see our capacity for faith grow. And not just grow, but to flourish, friends, to flourish in our lives and beyond the doors of this sanctuary. Now, next week, we move into Thanksgiving. It's a good time of year, right? We will move into that Thanksgiving mode, and we will intentionally start to reflect on that multitude of blessings that come to us as gifts from God. And as we do that, in this month particularly, may our gratitude deepen our relationship with God and help our seed of faith to germinate and to grow. And so we say, thanks be to God. Amen.